Welcome to today's Skill Up. My name is Emily Spranger, and I am thrilled to be able to partner with our faculty and staff at NU. Today, we have the wonderful Dr. Lori Bedford coming to present today on crafting interview questions in qualitative research.
So great to be here today. As Dr. Spranger mentioned, I am a faculty member in the Sanford School of Education. I work in the one-to-one program, individualized program, we call it now. I'm Legacy NCU, happy to be part of the NU family. I joined NCU when they still had contract faculty. We got 1099s, and then in 2014, they brought us all on as part-time. 2019, I was privileged to become full-time faculty. So been with the organization a long time. Primarily, I work with doctoral students through the entire process, and I also teach qualitative research courses, as well as being the specialization lead for ESL. So my pleasure to be here today. This is one of the issues that's kind of near and dear to my heart because I think oftentimes the interview questions when we're doing qualitative research and our strategy is to interview participants for data. It seems like sometimes our interview questions are kind of an afterthought. Like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess I've got my proposal all done. I guess I need some interview questions before I can submit to the IRB. And it's actually really the opposite, that the interview questions are super, super important. How we ask them, what we ask them, what the content and context for those are. And we're going to talk about all of that today. All right, let's see if I can. There we go. Quick objectives, some of the things we're going to do, just talk about writing good interview questions and how do we know what to ask, and then how do we word them to get the data that we need to answer our research questions. So just to back up a little bit, so about qualitative research and a qualitative interview. There are many, many, many types of data collection in qualitative research. We can use artifacts, we can use focus group data, we can do observations, we can look at documents, all those kinds of things. But the interview is really a common way to collect data for qualitative research. It's pretty time consuming and it takes a lot of resources just in terms of energy and time and expertise, but we can really get some great data through qualitative interviews. So a few things to remember just about that our interviews are centered on the participants. So as researchers, we're really passionate about our topic and we have lots and lots and lots of expertise. But what we want to get from the participant. So while, we have this, that as a qualitative researcher, we are an instrument of the research because it is an interactive process. I'm asking a question, I might ask a follow-up, I might ask clarifying questions. So as we're moving along in a semi-structured interview, I'm building on what I asked them, but it's really all about the participant. So we don't add any of our own thoughts, any of our own ideas. It's a conversation in that we are focusing on the participant and not what we believe or what we've observed or what we think, really to focus on the participant. So also something to think about and remember, and I think this is pretty straightforward in most cases, but sometimes we get confused about the difference between a research question and an interview question. And so sometimes I've seen students who have this confusion write a research question that says things like, how do you describe something? What are your strategies for something? So when we use you in the question, that's an interview question because it focuses on the individual. A research question focuses on the population. How do teachers, how do administrators, how do pharmacists, or whomever your population is? And just to back up for a minute, because I'm starting to give some examples. I work in the College of Education, and so my examples come from education. So those of you not from the College of Education, just think about your own populations, your own topics, and fill them in. If you have specific questions about that, Emily can stop me, and we can kind of talk about how that would apply. So really, I think that the bottom line here is, why do the interview questions matter? What difference does it make if we get some data, if the participants tell us something, if we're able to, write up some findings? Why does it matter what we ask and how we ask it? And the bottom line to that is that the interview questions result in data, your qualitative data, and that answers your research questions. So we want to be really thoughtful and really purposeful that the data that we get will answer those research questions. And sometimes, not a lot, but I have seen students come out of data collection and be like, here's my data. And there's really nothing in there that maybe answers one of the research questions, or there's data in there that answers something else that's sometimes really interesting, but it wasn't what we were focused on. And there's ways to deal with that, but we don't want to have to do that. So the data that we want to get to answer our research questions, a couple of things that are really important that characterizes those data. And just as a hint, when we're talking about research, data is plural. So those data, these data. In the lay world, we say this data and that data. But as researchers, we refer to these data and those data. So just something to keep in mind as you're writing about the data you collect. So the first thing to think about here, or not the first thing, but one of the things, is you want to be sure you get enough data to answer your research questions. And as we talk about specific interview questions and kind of some of the pitfalls, we'll talk about why we might not get the data we need. But our goal is to get thick, rich data. And that's kind of thrown around sometimes. Rarely do I see that cited by Geertz. Geertz in 1973 was the first person, really the seminal author, to talk about thick, rich data. And if you're really interested in that, hear what he has to say. So thick, rich data means that it has the depth, it has the breadth, it gives us insightful new information. If we don't get that sufficiency of data, if we don't ask the right questions, our data can oftentimes be very superficial and not really get to the heart of what it is we want to add to the body of knowledge. So students will say, how much data do I need? And there's a rule of thumb. I don't know that it's a rule of thumb. It's something I've always heard, that in a 60-minute interview, we should have about 10 pages of typed transcribed data. So that's a lot. And I also see students a lot who will say, I'm going to do 60-minute interviews. It's hard to get to 60 minutes. Unless we have really deep, rich questions that we can have conversations around. So we really have to think about those. So if we have, 10 participants, that's maybe 100 pages of data. So if we get, close to where we think we're done with data collection, and we have, 20 pages of data from, 15 participants, I think we really need to start thinking about that sufficiency of data. Is it really thick and rich, or is it more superficial? The other part of that is saturation then. And saturation comes from Lincoln and Guba, again, who's seminal authors in trustworthiness, really someone that every dissertation should be citing. That's qualitative, in my opinion. But saturation is a way to ensure trustworthiness. And it means that you're not getting any new data. Okay, so in qualitative research, oftentimes in the dissertation process, we kind of interview all our participants and then we look at the data. That really should be done simultaneously because we want to be analyzing the data as we're moving through the interviews to see what new ideas. And we're not talking about analysis in this particular webinar, but if you remember, the first part of, let's say, a thematic analysis is to be familiar with the data. So you read the data, you think about the data, you write memos, maybe some initial thoughts, what some codes might be. So you're starting to get an idea of what those data are telling you. So when a student says to me, how many participants should I have? The answer is, that's a terrible answer, but that depends. That depends on when you think you'll reach saturation. That's usually a range. It has to do with the participants that you're selecting. So if you're doing, say, for example, maximum variation sampling, where you have, uh, characteristics that are a little bit different among participants, still within your inclusion criteria, but you may, for example, say have teachers from different grade levels or maybe different subjects, but still meet the inclusion criteria. You might need more because for saturation, you might be getting a little bit different ideas from those participants who have a little bit different characteristics. If all of your teachers have very similar, or all your participants have very similar characteristics, maybe you'll reach saturation before that. So, it's really hard to, say I'm going to have this many participants in your proposal because you really don't know. We can make some guesses based on, again, your sampling, the kinds of questions you're asking, the data that you expect to get, those kinds of things. So before we move on, Emily, are there any questions in the chat so far?
Right now, oops, so sorry about that. Right
That's
now, there are no questions that have popped up in the chat, but do keep in mind that you're welcome to put them in there.
Yep. Okay. Perfect. So remember alignment. So if you're in any of the research courses, we have talked about alignment. So we know that the research problem is the foundation, the cornerstones of your research. Everything builds off of the problem, particularly the purpose and then the research questions. And we know that the research questions also drive the design. It's how the research questions are written, the kinds of data that you're going to need to answer them will drive the design. And your interview questions also need to be aligned with these parts of the proposal. So again, remember that your interview questions are going to give you the data that answer your research questions. This is really, again, often kind of an afterthought, but really one of the most important parts of your research. So where do interview questions come from? And so this is kind of really, really the heart of the matter. So especially when the interview questions become kind of an afterthought, it's like, oh, my proposal's done. I need to submit it to the IRB. Oh, I need some interview questions. So we sit down and we write some interview questions. We don't want to take interview questions from our experience, what we hope to find out, what we assume about the topic, all those things that are in our head. One of the benefits and the challenges of the research that we do is that we typically engage in research that we are passionate about, things that we've had a lot of experience and expertise in. We really need to be careful that that does not introduce bias. As a researcher, while we are an instrument and we are part of the study itself, we also need to step back and make sure that we aren't thinking about what it is we want to find out. One of the things to be really careful about, and I think has happened, I've seen kind of this path, that novice researchers see a problem in their practice. They experience a problem in their practice, and people just aren't listening to them. And so the idea is if I do research and I come up with findings that show we need to do this, or this is what the problem is, then we can move forward with this particular solution. We really want to avoid that. While we're passionate, we always have some ideas about what we think we'll find. One of the questions I always ask in a defense is, what surprised you about this? What did you think you found that you didn't, or what didn't you think you'd find that you did? Because we always come in with some of those notions. So interview questions must come from our literature review and from our framework. These are really, really also incredibly important parts of your proposal. Similar to the interview questions, I think sometimes these are kind of afterthoughts. We are thinking about our problem, our purpose, our questions, our analysis, how we're going to engage with the study without thinking what provides context. So remember, the research problem, the gap in the literature that we're going to fill, the gap in the literature that the answers to our research questions are going to fill reflects a gap in the literature. So we need to use that literature to drive our data towards that gap. And the other part of it is your framework, whether it's a conceptual framework or a theoretical framework. Frameworks provide guidance to our study. So we need to think about how those frameworks might guide the data we collect. And a problem that might happen is that the literature or the framework are not reflected in the research questions or in the problem statement. So that's really important that all these pieces tie together and we really think about the literature and the framework as we're thinking about our questions.
Dr.
So here's
Bedford,
something, go ahead.
would it be okay?
Yeah, you
Okay,
bet.
great. Just before you move on, in the chat, this question came up, and keep in mind, for all of our participants, there are different doctorates. One, whether it's the applied doctorate or the PhD route. So, in case you hear a terminology that you're not familiar with, if it doesn't fit in your section option for a dissertation or chapter option, but this particular question came from the chapter.
Okay,
Format. So we're
okay.
asked to provide the population and sample in Chapter 3 research method, which
Uh-huh.
includes the anticipated number of participants. What if we can't reach that number or need to increase the number of participants?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's a question, those are discussions that you should have with your chair. And that's why I like to have a range. To say I'm going to interview 15 people. I may reach saturation at 12. I may not reach saturation until 18, so I might need a range.
Yeah, and
Um,
I'm glad you bring that up. That was from my personal experience. I said 10 to 12. I ended up getting to 10 and reaching saturation. And so after I did my revisions, I updated my document to then
yeah,
say 10 participants.
yep,
So, and I did qualitative research. So if that helps
yeah.
with this particular question in the chat. Anything else on that piece, Dr. Bedford?
Yeah, the only thing I want to say that about that, again, that's, a discussion to have with your chair and looking at
Yes.
the data and making sure you actually have reached saturation. Or sometimes you can't find participants and you haven't reached saturation. So those are issues, again, to discuss with your chair how you might navigate through that. But the other thing to be really careful about is, so if you say to the IRB, I'm going to interview between 12 and 15 participants who have these characteristics. If you change some things in there, I'm not an IRB expert, I would reach out to them and ask them if it's okay if you make these changes. I didn't find enough participants at school A, so I'm going to add another school so I can go recruit from there. It's probably an IRB modification. If we say I'm going to interview between, 12 and 15 and you end up with 16 participants, that might be worth an email and just say, hey, am I okay in this territory?
I'm so glad you brought that up, Dr. Bedford. And by the way, our very next skill up next week is the IRB recruitment informed
Yep,
consent materials process
yep,
application component. So I'll pop that registration link in the chat. And that's it. Thank you
perfect.
so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, yeah. Always when you're collecting data, be sure to just have the IRB people be your friend. I've had a couple situations with students where something has happened. One in particular started just talking to their colleagues, like, "Hey, you want to be in my study? Okay, I'll write you down." And like, is that recruiting before you get IRB permission? Let's talk to them and have a conversation. It's all fine. But we just want to kind of be on the up and up and just make sure that we have those conversations. And the dissertation is a learning experience. So when things happen, we work through them.
Thank you so much.
Yep. Okay. So just here's an example of something that I like to see. I ask my students to do this and use it as an appendix when they're thinking about their interview questions. And we can start doing this early on in our study as we're reviewing the literature for our literature review. I think sometimes a literature review is just seen as kind of a tedious task. But the literature review really informs your problem statement. It informs your interview questions, as we're talking about. It informs your analysis. In qualitative research, those are, again, similarly, that's where your codes come from, is the literature. And that's, again, how you demonstrate that you filled the gap that you said you were going to fill. It comes full circle. So I ask students to, think about their research question and then why they're asking that from the perspective of the literature. So this is where then we can really reflect on, now, am I asking this because I'm hoping to find out that the participants do this way? Or is the literature telling me that this is important? And sometimes this will reflect a narrow population. Say, for example, I am studying how teachers implement math curriculum, which is pretty broad, but if we just say that. And so I read, so that's my gap in the literature. It's not, but just for the sake of argument, there's no research on how teachers implement math curriculum, so that's the gap I'm going to fill. Well, there is a lot of literature on how teachers implement reading curriculum. So for my rationale, I might say, the strategies that teachers use for reading curriculum are this. So I might ask about that specifically. See if that's the same thing in math, or do they do something different? Include the source, and then which research question we think these data will answer. Sometimes it's more than one. Sometimes a research question, or data from an interview question can answer more than one research question. As we start coding and identifying themes, that can happen. But, these are our initial thoughts about why we're including these questions. These questions, this table here as an appendix is also really helpful, I think, in your IRB application, because it demonstrates that you're not introducing bias into your study. So yeah, just an easy table, an easy way to think about the questions we're going to ask. So the other thing to think about, so we've got the literature, is thinking about our interview questions in terms of the research design. Now we're really getting into how we're asking them. So these are some research designs that are used in qualitative dissertations sometimes. Just a really brief, what's different about a case study that's different about a narrative inquiry? How does the data look different with each of these research designs? And I don't know, as novice researchers, we always get to this. We should be able to have a very specific plan for data collection, data analysis, every part of our study, that we can't just drop in a different design. So for example, if I've designed a case study and then I'm like, oh, you know what? I really just want to do qualitative descriptive. I shouldn't be able just to drop that in. There should be very specific ways that my case study is designed that makes it unique from other designs. In that same vein, our interview questions also will be very aligned with the design. Now, I'm going to say too that these are not the best interview questions ever written by far. I'm sure that if we talked about these, if we worked on these, we could really change them into something way more robust. Um, and so interview protocols kind of take writing, reflecting, having some discourse. If you're into transformational learning, it's that whole cycle of that. So again, it isn't just a matter of opening up a Word document and typing up 10 questions. It's really thinking about what we're going to ask and what we think we're going to get from those data. So for example, in a case study, we're looking at a bounded system. So in this case, the interview question that I gave as an example is about if the bounded system, say, is a classroom. So it might be about the teacher, but we also want questions about that bounded system. So what do they observe the students doing? What else is happening in that bounded system that they can talk about? We might ask them about, support that they get for whatever the phenomenon is you're studying. So we want to ask them about a number of things and make sure we capture that bounded system. Phenomenology is about lived experiences. So we want to think about value, meaning, beliefs that happen over time as people interact with that phenomenon, how the phenomenon how their lived experiences, so lived experiences throughout their life, how those are influenced or how they are shaped by the experiences that they have. So, how is your thinking about the value of technology integration evolved over time? So we may have a larger picture. We may be talking about other things, but this is an example of how they've made meaning out of this. And just as a sidebar, I think we also need to remember that there's a difference between experiences and lived experiences. Experiences are just things that happen to us. Very useful in research. We talk about them all the time. Hey, what happened on that day when the person came in and provided that training for you? A lived experience is about those things that shape our values, our thinking, our understanding, how we make meaning of whatever the phenomenon is. So it's a different kind of experience that we're studying. Qualitative descriptive is a design that we need to be very careful about using. We see it a lot in the last few years, I've seen it mostly in nursing education, and it's becoming more accepted throughout education and other disciplines. But not every author, not every researcher, not every faculty member recognizes that as a research design for many reasons, which I'm not going to go into here. And there are valid oppositions to that. So if you're thinking about using a qualitative descriptive design, that's something you're going to want to talk to your chair about whether or not that would be the path to take. But qualitative description is just that. It's just description. It's usually exploratory. We usually use it for a study for which a broad gap in the literature exists. We're just kind of doing some preliminary research on a topic that that we need to add to the body of knowledge about. So we're going to just talk about describe a lesson. Tell me about how you do this. Tell me about what happened when. Describe an experience in which that kind of thing we're going to ask. In narrative inquiry, we want to get participants talking about a story. So we're going to ask them about experiences, what they did, how things turned out for them. We want their stories. And grounded theory, process and theory is what our goal is. We rarely do grounded theory in dissertation research, once in a while. But then we're going to ask participants to describe their processes. We're going to ask them to describe how they do things, what was their decision making, on what do they base those decisions, those kinds of things in order to get the data. So I talked about these longer than I was going to, but I really just wanted to kind of get you thinking about how you're framing these research questions, or excuse me, how you're framing the interview questions and what kind of data you're going to get from them. Any questions about that, Emily?
Not at this time.
Okay, super. We'll go on then. Okay. So we've talked about interview questions coming from the literature. We've talked about them and the framework. We've talked about them um, being aligned with your research design. We've talked about the need to get enough data. So now we're going to sit down and actually write them. And this slide here is about the nature of your interview questions and how we frame them. Just a few things. I think that it seems, we know that yes, no questions are not qualitative. I often see, things like, do you think technology should be used in the classroom? Why or why not? So, I mean, that's okay. I suppose it technically is open-ended because of the why or why not. But what you're going to get is yes, because I think it's a great tool. So what I'm going to talk about here now are problems with getting that sufficiency of data, to getting that thick, rich data, to getting an hour interview or 45-minute interview with people, your participants. So if all your questions are kind of like this, 15 minutes, you're going to be through 10 questions easy. And you're going to have 2 or 3 sentences for each, and you're going to have maybe a page and a half of data. That's not thick, rich data. You probably get to saturation quickly just because you're not getting in-depth information. So think about how you might just shift that to get them talking more. Okay. Another similar problem is asking questions that result in a list. What strategies do you use? What professional development have you attended? In what courses were these concepts introduced? You're going to get a list. 1, 2, 3. Again, sufficiency of data is not there. Depth to the information is not there. These kinds of questions are technically quantitative because they're just you can categorize them and you can give them a percentage, all those things. These really are not qualitative questions. Another problem with interview questions that I see we're asking them to think about what somebody else thinks or speculate on something. What do you think your students think about that? What's going through your administrator's head when they're, doing this? We want to ask them about them, and we can get this information by, describing how your students respond when you use technology. And I think a better way to say this might be describe what you observe your students doing when you use technology. Okay, because how they respond, again, maybe like they're happy, they're excited. What is it that you see? I see them talking, I see them raising their hand, I see them engaged, or, I see them, not participating, whatever it is, then conclusions certainly can be drawn from what they see, but we don't know what somebody else is thinking or what motivates them. And then be careful that our questions don't assume participants have had a certain experience. And this is also, how have you overcome challenges? Those kinds of questions. If we ask these kinds of questions, we need to sample for this. So if we want to ask our participants how they've overcome challenges to something, then one of our inclusion criteria is that the participants have had challenges. Otherwise, they might say, I haven't had any challenges to overcome. And these are kind of hard to kind of shift into a more open-ended, how do you perceive your principal's role in your successful technology integration? They might say he didn't have a role. And, it might be, and argued that, well, that assumes that he had a role. But I think it opens the door more for a variety of answers. The first one here, sometimes participants, they want to hear about some challenges. So whether or not the challenges were a big deal, it kind of forces them to talk about that. A couple other issues just over here on the left. Be really, really careful that we don't ask interview questions irrelevant to the research questions. That's where that table really helps. We are asking a ton from participants to give us their time to answer the research questions, to be honest with us, sometimes give us, personal feelings about things. And so we really want to honor that by only taking the time that we need and asking them things that we need. So, think about even especially demographic questions can fall into this. Do we really need to know what year you graduated from college? Maybe. Do we need to know your gender? Maybe. But think about why we might need those things. Also be careful about asking questions that are too broad. Think about what is it that you want to know. Don't or try to avoid hoping for information. Like, oh, I hope they go here. I hope they go there. Typically, your
May have
participants,
just froze.
huh?
It.
I'm here. Are we good?
Okay, great.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Good.
Oh,
Good. Good.
it's
Good.
my internet. I apologize. I'll
No,
stop
that's okay.
talking.
I had somebody else yesterday whose internet too. They were freezing, and I'm like, is it me? Once in a
So
while.
sorry. So sorry. Carry
Nope,
on.
nope, we're good. We're good. We're good. Okay, two more things on this slide. Asking participants questions that they might not understand. So we might say, I'm going to ask teachers about their emotional intelligence. Um, Teachers probably know what emotional intelligence is. But so if someone asks me, describe to me your emotional intelligence, I know what emotional intelligence is, but I'm not sure I could describe that. So, what is it you really want to know about that? Describe how you approach this kind of thing. You describe how you feel after this happens. So, the literature will help you get to that. What are those nuances that make up emotional intelligence? And the last thing to be really careful about is prompting participants with definitions and explanations. Okay, so we describe, emotional intelligence is described as A, B, and C. Tell me how you fit into that. So, what we're getting participants to do is answer our perception of what we think it is, or what we read in the literature, probably is. We want to know what participants think about that. So, even if they answer completely wrong, something that has nothing to do with it, that gives us a lot of data. We're like, oh, teachers may not be, or participants may not be familiar with this topic. And so we collect whatever data we get, and we let the data take us wherever we need. So again, lots going on this slide. I talked a lot. Emily, anything?
Right now, there hasn't been a question that has popped up, but I do think it's interesting. I like the idea how you mentioned, people kind of have a general idea about what, for example, emotional intelligence is, but being able to kind of frame it in a way that makes sense to the person who you're interviewing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate you explaining it that way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And yeah, and also just to be really careful that we don't assume that, because if somebody doesn't know what that means and they're sitting there, and how awkward is that? So we try to make sure that the questions we ask, there's shared understanding, and that we know that there is. All right. A few other things that we want to think about, as these are really qualitative issues, but they really rise to the top when we're doing qualitative interviews. So positionality and reflexivity go hand in hand. And I don't know why I have power structures in the middle, but go hand in hand. Because our positionality describes who we are in relation to the research. If I am going to interview teachers about how they implement a math curriculum, and I am I am a curriculum specialist, and I wrote the curriculum that they're using, and I have taught math for 25 years. That matters in the research, and that's important for the reader of our research to understand. So positionality shares with the reader how we fit into the research. Reflexivity then describes what we're going to do about it. Okay, so how are we going to make sure that we can step back from maybe our professional role, our professional experience, our opinions about it, and make sure that we are as unbiased as we can be? I would argue that we can never be completely unbiased because we're people and we have ideas and we believe things. And so, but it's really about managing that. And we do that through a number of strategies, like writing those research questions around the literature review. So we aren't asking what we want to find out. We're asking questions about where the literature takes us. We do memoing as one of our first steps to the analysis process. So after we get the data, step one in a thematic analysis, again, is to familiarize yourself with the data. And one of those parts is memos. And memos can be, oh, this looks like a theme is starting here. Maybe there's going to be a theme around this. I don't know. Another important part of memoing is just to think about, oh, this was really interesting. This is not my experience at all. And personally, I disagree with this. Keep this in mind. This is a note to myself. Keep this in mind, self, as you're going through here to be aware of this. And also for students, novice researchers, just to keep that journal. After every interview, after every part of the research, talk about in your journal how it went, how you felt, how did the information sit with you, all those things to help you think about how we can be as unbiased as possible. And then the last part, and I'm not sure we talk about this a lot, but I think it's really important to think about power structures in our research. And so a really, common thing is just the example I gave. I'm the curriculum director, and I'm going to interview people about how they're implementing my curriculum. Well, that's going to be really hard for many teachers to say anything, but it's fabulous. It's easy. Everything is going great. How am I going to manage that? The other power structures are also who we are as people. When I did my own dissertation research like a lifetime ago, I am a white middle class person getting a PhD, a professional. I interviewed people with disabilities who were seeking education in various ways, as seeking education. So we had people with disabilities. Some of them were people of color. They were from low socioeconomic situations. They were not as privileged as I was in many ways. And to recognize that, how that might influence. Do they feel like, oh, well, she's getting a PhD, so she must be really smart, so I should just go along with this? We don't want people to feel like that. We want we want our participants to have autonomy and have a voice and be able to, interviews, data collection is always voluntary to say, I just can't go on with this. This isn't what I thought it was going to be. For no reason. Didn't mean you did anything wrong. They're just like, I'm uncomfortable with this and I'm going to drop out. People need to have permission or permission to ask questions about what you're going to do with the data. How are you going to protect their confidentiality? All those things. And when we have those power differentials, people don't always recognize that. So I think my next slide, I believe, is the bibliography. So this, I think, is a really great way to end this, is just to think about our participants. And this isn't as much as writing interview questions is really collecting the data. But I think if we keep this in mind in our interview questions as well, and just as we're doing our research, I think that we do a huge service to our population and the people that ultimately we want to help. I mean, that's what our research is for. We have a problem. Here's a population. They're experiencing a problem. And we want to provide some information so that we can make decisions to make this better for them.
Absolutely.
Right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bedford.
Yeah, just quick. So this is a quick bibliography. These, in my opinion, would be all seminal sources that you could use. Some of them are fairly old. Geertz, you have Lincoln and Guba. But as we know, it's fine to quote seminal sources when we are talking about research methods. Go ahead, Dr. Springer. Sorry.
Wonderful. Oh, geez, no worries whatsoever. No. No, this is great, and I really appreciate all of kind of the varied approaches and ideas to as we think about how we want to develop and what needs to go into making interview questions impactful, but also thoughtful as qualitative researchers. So
Mhm,
there was a question that came up in the chat.
mhm.
Someone had kind of come in a little bit later in the session and they had asked how many questions are appropriate for qualitative research.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one of those things that, the answer is it depends, which we hate. Don't we all hate that? It depends. So if you came in on time to hear about saturation, rich, thick data, it kind of depends on how much data you're going to get from those questions and how you're going to make sure that your data is thick and rich, how long you're going to keep the participants. So, I mean, if you have a bunch of questions that you want people to list stuff, which is not going to give you thick, rich data, but it's also not going to be very much. If you have those you might need more. If questions elicit real conversation, follow-up, clarifying questions, those kinds of things, you need fewer. I would recommend when you write your interview protocol, you sit down with family, a friend, a colleague, someone, and ask them those questions, which you can do. You can't use those data in your research, but you can practice with it and see how long it takes. And usually it goes a lot quicker than we're going to. And I am just going to, since we talked about that, I do want to make just something about, and this is my opinion, ask your chair, reach out to the IRB. But I often get questions about, well, so I'm doing semi-structured interviews and I've got some interview questions. And I've often seen it's Q&A. Here's your question, I get an answer. Question, answer, question, answer. They said, what about follow-up, probing, those kinds of questions? And I get questions about, well, they weren't on my protocol. Can I ask them? My opinion, again, confirm. I'm going to confirm with the IRB, confirm with your chair. But my answer is yes. And here's the example I give. So if my research or my interview question is about doing the dishes, and I ask Emily how she does the dishes, she starts talking about it, and I can ask her follow-up questions. Now, how much soap do you use? Now, do you scrub the inside and outside of the bowls? Do you rinse after? I mean, I can ask all those questions about washing the dishes. And that's part of that question. But I can't ask Emily about how she does laundry.
That
So,
makes a lot of sense.
yeah,
Thank you
something
so much
different.
for
Yeah.
that. But the answer is I use the dishwasher. Um,
Okay. So one of my inclusion criteria is people who don't have a dishwasher.
Okay, there you go. Exactly. You got to make sure that's very
Yeah,
clear.
yeah, yep.
There's several people in the chat. Thank you so much for the presentation. A lot of great practical information to consider as they are working on their studies. So I didn't have any other questions come
Perfect.
up,
All right.
Dr. Bedford, but if anything does pop up, let's say you finish watching this recording at a later time and something kind of bubbles to the top, don't hesitate to reach out in the comments and pose
Yep,
those questions in there. That's always a
yep,
good space to kind of keep dialogue going
yeah,
about research endeavors.
yep. If you have
So
something, sorry, if you have something specific to this, feel free to email me. I think I'm either in the system or my email was there, or you can share it, Emily, however you
yep,
want.
it's lbedford@nu.edu, first initial, last name, and then of course
Yeah,
at
yeah. And there's only one
nu.edu.
of me, so no numbers.
That's correct. There is only one. Um, Thank you all so much for coming today. I really appreciate you taking the time to try to learn a little bit more, get a little bit more tools in your tool belt as you're working on your own research projects and in your own research endeavors. And of course, when you're done with your dissertation, these are still insightful things if you decide to conduct research elsewhere beyond your dissertation experience. So thank everyone so much for coming. Thank you so much, Dr. Bedford. And until the next time, I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Take care.
Bye-bye.